This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to take a look at the most overpowered 1-mana creatures in the game. 1 mana is, obviously enough, a very small investment. Because of that, it doesn't take much for a 1-mana creature to end up being amazing. While most of my lists are based on a scoring system that rewards cards with points for finishing in the top 8 at high-level Magic events, lately I've also been doing another kind of video, one that doesn't use a scoring system and is instead based on how powerful a card was or is in various formats. Keep in mind, this is not a ranking of the 1-drops based on how much play they have seen in competitive Magic. Those are the kinds of cards that get rewarded in my more typical top 10 videos, so doing the same thing here wouldn't be very fruitful. Although obviously there's going to be some overlap, the two lists overall look very different. If you want that list, I already did a more traditional top 10 on 1-drop creatures, though it could use an update. Anyway, for a card to end up here, it either needs to have been banned or restricted in at least one format, or alternatively, be a card that has helped define a format or formats based on how much it was played. The ranking on this list isn't necessarily these cards being compared to one another. What I'm ranking is just how busted a card was in its original context, and that doesn't always mean that a card higher up on the list is better than one that appears lower on the list by today's standard. Alright, without further ado, here are my picks for the top 10 most overpowered 1-drops of all time. At number 10, I've got the cream of the crop mana dorks. That is, Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, and Noble Hierarch. All three of these have been multi-format all-stars over the years, and anytime they've been legal in Standard, they have been incredibly heavily played there. This is because they all allow you to get to your more powerful spells before your opponent does, and they start doing it on turn 2 because they're so cheap. Birds also comes with flying and can tap for mana of any color. It also has the distinction of being one of only a handful of cards, apart from the Power 9, that has achieved at least one top 8 every single year since Tournament Magic began. Llanowar Elves has a super useful creature type and can tap for green, and the Hierarch can tap for any of the banned colors, and Exalted also means that your creatures can attack more effectively if she's in play. All three of these have seen play in every single format they've ever been legal in, including the Eternal formats. The reason they appear so low on this list is because, despite all of that power, I don't think anyone would really tell you they are unfair cards either. They're just really, really good. Good enough for every format, but not so good that they've ever needed to ban any of them. At number 9, I've got Delver of Secrets. For 1 blue mana, this 1/1 checks the top card of your library every upkeep, and if you reveal an instant or sorcery, it becomes a 3/2 flyer. Like the Mana Dorks, Delver of Secrets has never been banned anywhere, but it has seen heavy play in every single format it's ever been legal in at one time or another. This is because in the decks that use it, it's a fairly automatic 1-mana 3/2 flyer. The decks it's played in are usually spell-heavy tempo decks that look to stick the Delver and then protect it with counter magic and lots of interaction. At one time or another, Delver has been a format-defining card, especially in Modern, Pauper, and Legacy, and that's a status it still has in Pauper and Legacy today. But while it is quite powerful, it has remained legal in every format too. The remaining cards in this list have all been banned or restricted in at least one format. At number 8, it's Curd Ape, which was banned in Extended. For 1 red mana, the Ape is a 1/1, but it's a 2/3 if you control a forest. The Ape was in the argument for best 1-drop in the game for the first few years of Magic. This is because it often amounted to being a 1-mana 2/3 thanks to dual lands. That's a good stat line today, and back in the 1990s, it was completely insane. When the Extended format was announced in 1997, they wanted to make sure aggro decks in the format weren't too good, and they would have been if they allowed Curd Ape to be legal in the format. That said, Curd Ape got a reprint in 9th edition some years later, making it legal in Extended again, and by then Curd Ape was still good and saw heavy play, but it wasn't so good that it had to be banned that time around. At number 7, it's Monastery Swiftspear. For 1 red, it's a 1/2 with haste and prowess. Prowess gives it +1/+1 until end of turn for any non-creature spell you cast. This makes it an amazing 1-drop in spell-heavy decks, as it's often swinging with 2 or 3 power and growing at instant speed. It's seen heavy play in every format apart from Vintage. While it was good, it never ended up being too broken in any of those formats, but a common reprint in Double Masters 2022 changed things, because suddenly this powerful 1-drop was legal in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. The Swift Spear quickly asserted itself in the format, making red aggro and burn decks the best in the format by a wide margin because they were insanely fast. And in the end, Monastery's Swift Spear was banned to slow those decks down and allow other decks in the format some space to do more diverse things. At number 6, it's Wild Nacatl, a card modeled after fellow overpowered 1-drop, Curdape. For 1 green, it's a 1/1, and it gets +1/+1 if you have a mountain, and +1/+1 if you have a plains. As with Curdape, it turned out it was pretty easy to have this at its maximum size, even in the extremely early game, thanks to lands with multiple types. So the Nacatl was often a 1-mana 3/3. With fetch lands in the mix, it was even easier to get it to its maximum size than it was with Curdape back in the day. It helped power some awesome aggro decks in Standard and Extended, but it didn't feel completely insane in those formats either. So when they created the Modern format in 2011, Wild Nacatl was not a card they were worried about. It didn't appear on the preemptive ban list. This quickly proved to be a mistake, as Naya aggro decks crushed the competition at the first 2 major Modern events, Pro Tour Philadelphia in 2011 and the 2011 World Championship. These decks were dominant thanks to lots of overstated creatures, and Wild Nacatl was the biggest offender, so they decided to ban it to slow down the format. This was ultimately successful, and the Nacatl remained banned in the format for 3 years. They unbanned it in 2014, once the format had become more powerful, and while it went back to seeing play in the format and still sees a lot of action today, it was no longer a completely broken 1-drop. Over the years, it's also seen play in Legacy, though not quite as consistently as it has in Modern. At number 5, it's Cauldron Familiar. For 1 black, it's a 1/1 that gains you 1 life and makes your opponent lose 1 life when it enters the battlefield, and you can sacrifice a food to return Cauldron Familiar from your graveyard to the battlefield. Cauldron Familiar is a really pesky recursive creature because it can come back at instant speed to block stuff while also generating a 2-point life swing. Food was far too easy to make in Standard for this card to be remotely fair, and it was particularly insane alongside Witch's Oven. This gave you an amazing engine where you could sacrifice the familiar every turn, then make a food token, then sacrifice the food to get the familiar back, and it didn't take any mana at all. Things got even stupider once Mayhem Devil or Korvold were in the mix, because you would get sacrifice triggers at the same time. This made things pretty impossible for creature-based decks that weren't sacrifice decks, as you just couldn't damage them on the ground, and they just keep gaining life. This resulted in the familiar getting banned in Standard and Historic to weaken these sacrifice decks. As they usually do when they ban a card in Historic, they introduced a powered down version, and it goes a long way towards helping us understand what makes the original familiar so good. Because the rebalanced version of Cauldron Familiar is the same, except it can't block. You still have access to that engine, but the familiar being unable to block means you can't mix a chump block in with all that value. In addition to being overpowered in Standard and Historic, it's also really good in Pioneer, where it's still doing its thing and powering sacrifice decks in the format. At number 4, it's Goblin Lackey. For 1 red mana, it's a 1/1, and when it does combat damage to an opponent, you can put a goblin from your hand onto the battlefield. When the Lackey was originally printed, it wasn't a problematic card. In fact, didn't really see play anywhere. There just weren't powerful enough goblins in the game. This meant it wasn't really a relevant card in Blocker Standard, but that all changed in 2002 with the release of Onslaught Block, which had a very heavy goblin theme and lots of powerful goblins. Now you could put Goblin Ward Chief, Goblin Pile Driver, or Siege Gang Commander into play for no mana on turn 2, and that made Goblin decks in Extended completely broken. They ran roughshod over the format in 2002 and 2003 until the Lackey got banned, and it remained banned for as long as it would have been in the rotation for Extended. The Lackey hasn't been banned in other formats, but it has been a key part of Goblin decks in both Legacy and Vintage over the years, too. At number 3, it's Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, which is banned in Historic, Legacy, and Brawl. For 1 red mana, it's a 2/1, and when it hits an opponent, you make a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library, and until end of turn you can cast that card. He also comes with Dash, which means you can pay an alternate cost of 1 generic and a red to cast him with haste, and he returns to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. In other words, Ragavan is a nicely statted 1-drop that is also an insane value engine, since it gives you mana and cards. It's from Modern Horizons 2, so it's never been legal in Standard or Pioneer, but it has proven to be good enough for Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and it asserted itself so effectively in Legacy that it had to be banned there. Its ubiquity in Modern and Vintage are further testaments to how good it is. He also had to be banned in Brawl, Arena's Commander format, because always playing him on turn 1 simply allowed players to run away with the game far too often. In addition to being great in 60 card and 99 card formats, Ragavan is also one of the best cards in the Vintage Cube, a Magic Online cube that features the game's most powerful cards. Luis Scott Vargas is pretty much the foremost expert on the cube, and the only card he has in front of Ragavan on his pick order are the Power 9 minus Time Twister, Sol Ring, Oko, and Minskin Boo. In other words, it's the top creature in the most powerful limited format, too. At number 2, it's Disciple of the Vault. For 1 black mana, the Disciple is a 1/1, and whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses 1 life. The Disciple was printed in Mirrodin block, a set famous for having a pile of absurdly powerful artifacts in it, and it just so happens that one of the best of those, Arcbound Ravager, can sacrifice artifacts to make itself grow. If you combine the Ravager with Disciple of the Vault, lethal damage is pretty close to automatic, because these artifact affinity decks in block standard and extended always had a board filled with free or cheap artifacts, so it was incredibly easy to do a ton of damage in the very early game. This led to many cards from the deck getting banned in block standard and extended, so that these artifact decks weren't quite as explosive, and Disciple of the Vault was one of the cards that got the axe. Many years later, in 2022, a similar series of events played out in Pauper. That year, lots of new artifacts got printed in Modern Horizons 2, including a new cycle of artifact lands, and new common artifacts with affinity, and this led to affinity dominance in yet another format. While Arcbound Ravager wasn't reprinted at common or anything, thank God, you could instead combine the Disciple with Atog. The Tog actually got banned in the format first, but even after that, the deck put in a new free sacrifice outlet in Krark Clan Shaman, and Disciple of the Vault was still too good for the format, so it eventually got banned there too. In other words, Disciple of the Vault took an already insane deck in 4 different formats and made it utterly overpowered, so it had to be banned in all of them. And at number 1, I've got Deathrite Shaman, which is banned in both Modern and Legacy. For 1 hybrid black-green mana, the Shaman is a 1/2 with 3 activated abilities that exile cards of certain types from the graveyard for an effect. It can tap to exile a land and add 1 mana, you can pay 1 black and tap it and exile an instant or sorcery to make each opponent lose 2 life, or you can pay a green and tap it and exile a creature to gain 2 life. While it's seen play in every single format, it was especially busted in Modern and Legacy. Modern and Legacy were formats with easy access to ways to load the graveyard, and probably more importantly, fetch lands were legal in those formats. In other words, in Modern and Legacy, a turn 1 Deathrite Shaman generally made it a way better version of all the mana dorks we saw at number 10 on this list, because it could easily ramp your mana on turn 2, and then in the later stages of the game, it could be both a win condition and a way to outlast your aggressive opponent. That's way too much for a 1 mana card to be able to do in both Modern and Legacy. It got banned in Modern mere months after being printed, and it later got the axe in Legacy too. I think it's very clear that fetch lands are central to the Shaman's power, since it wasn't too good for Standard and isn't too good for Pioneer right now. However, keep your eye on Deathrite Shaman in Timeless, a new arena-only format that has fetch lands in it. That format isn't supposed to ban cards, but it does restrict them, so it'll be interesting to see if Deathrite Shaman remains legal in that format as a full 4-of. So, those are my picks for the most overpowered 1-mana creatures in Magic. If you want to own any of these amazing cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on the more than 700 other MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at the game's most overpowered cards, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.